Senator Wright.
Thank you. These are my last lot of questions. I hope they won't take very long. It's in relation to INSLM. Thanks. INSLM. So the Independent National Security Legislation Monitor. My first question is, Attorney General, if you could advise how the government intends to respond to the INSLM's previous reports and the further one due in June.
Well, Senator, I actually took a question on this topic in the Senate in the last sitting week, and the answer is we intend to. We intend to respond. Now, the reason I make that perhaps obvious reply is that it was by no means obvious that there was going to be a response to the INSLM's reports, because none of the reports by the INSLM were responded to by the previous Labor government. And when the coalition was elected in September last year, we found that for all the fuss that the Labor Party had made about this statutory office, his reports had been entirely disregarded, and some were some years old. So we will be responding to the reports. Now, what the response will be, what it will contain, you'll just have to wait until the response is finalised, but unlike the previous government, we will be responding.
That's good to hear. And what is there a projected time around about we could be expecting it?
Look, I'm not aware of it. There may be among those who are doing the work on this. I'm not in a position to tell you what it is tonight.
Okay, so there's legislation currently prepared to abolish the INSLM. How will the monitor's functions be continued? The monitor's functions will be continued by the various law reform and oversight bodies that exist. Let me give you an example. You'd be familiar, Senator, with the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. Now, that committee, during the life of the last Parliament, conducted, on the reference of Attorney General Roxon, conducted a very exhaustive review of Australia's national security laws, and by that I mean in particular the laws establishing the various national security agencies. And a unanimous report was tabled in the dying days of the last Parliament. Now, I use that to give you an example of how the parliamentary committee, through its own system, is not only capable of but does engage in very exhaustive law reform in this very area. Then there are the other statutory bodies that are responsible more generally for law reform, including, of course, the Australian Law Reform Commission. And this very committee, Senator, has as one of its functions to keep laws within Acts of Parliament within this portfolio under review. So the functions that the INSLM has performed will continue to be performed by bodies of that kind. So I'd just like to get your comments on each of these views that have been expressed that have raised concerns about that approach. First, there's the viewpoint that's been put that the conduct of, you've indicated, a various range of bodies would be involved in taking over those functions, and so the conduct of the oversight would be spread over a number of other oversight mechanisms, and it would potentially increase bureaucracy and dilute focus. So,
I don't agree with that, Senator. And can I just make the point to you? I hope you don't think this is a semantic difference. I don't think it is semantic. You said oversight, but there's a difference between review and oversight. Oversight, for which there are provisions elsewhere,
For example, the Independent National Security Monitor, the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, conducts oversight, and by oversight I mean oversees the operational activity of the agencies. But we're not talking here about oversight in that sense. What we're talking about is periodic reviews of the legislation in the manner of law reform.
Yeah, no, I do understand that. So given that there will be a sort of, if you like, an array of different bodies and organisations looking at, sometimes there'll be overlap, sometimes there won't be.
Well,
Isn't there a risk that there will be actually an increasing amount of bureaucracy and it'll be less efficient than having one organisation do it? That's certainly one view that's put.
Well, it might be, but I think it's wrong. Because these are not new bodies, these are existing bodies, so we're not creating a new body. In fact, what we're doing is removing a body, so or an office, so that will reduce rather than increase bureaucracy and reduce by one the number of such bodies. Nor do I think that any harm is done by having more than one set of eyes, as it were, on this legislation.
And as you've so rightly pointed out, that some of these bodies were already in existence at the time that the INSLM was established, which would suggest that there was a view at the time that their combined functions wouldn't be adequate to be able to do the kind of careful, ongoing, methodical review of the increased, perhaps in some cases, terrorism laws. So what would you say to that?
Well, I'll tell you what I'd say to that, Senator Wright. I agree with you up to a point, because I was a big supporter of the establishment of INSLM. It was established in the Parliament before last, in other words, during the life of the first Rudd government, and it was not an idea that came from the Labor Party, it was an idea that came from the Liberal Party. It was proposed originally by the former member for Kooyong, Mr Petro Georgiou, and it was moved in the Senate by former Senator Troth and seconded by me. So I could see and still can see the point of having such a body, but this was a savings measure. I mean, I don't mean to be tedious about this, but it is the stark, unbridgeable reality against which all public policy decisions must be measured at the moment, that the new government, the Abbott government, was elected, and when it was elected, inherited public debt of unprecedented levels, trending, according to Treasury, to a public debt of $667 billion. $667 billion, far and away the highest level of public debt in Australian history, debt that had escalated from 0% of GDP to 26% of GDP in just 6 years. So we had to find savings measures. This morning, Senator Wright, we had some discussion about the arts, and I pointed out to you that we had to reduce the arts budget by 3.1%. When the country had had a period of good Liberal government in the previous government, we were able to increase the arts budget by 65.8%. When government runs the economy well, you can do things that you can't afford to do when you've had a period of Labor government that has left a complete train wreck. So in a perfect world, if resource constraints were not an issue, it might be a good thing to have an INSLM, but we needed to find savings measures, and because there were bodies that were capable of doing the work of the INSLM, we identified this as a savings measure within the portfolio.
All right, well, perhaps if I could just take you, because that's an interesting observation, and I'm not clear, given that you indicate that it was largely a savings measure, and I understand you've given the back context for that, that there is actually an argument that the pre-existing conditions which made it a good idea have actually changed in any way that make it not a good idea now as opposed to being a savings measure.
Well, that's the way I put it, Senator. I couldn't have been more frank with you. My views about this have not changed over the years. I think this was a marginal benefit. These are all marginal judgments, and when we're looking for savings measures, obviously you cut at the margins rather than at the core.
And clearly it would have been helpful if indeed the previous reports had been effectively responded to. So
Well,
that
it
would
would have
be
been very helpful if they'd been
certainly
responded
that's
to at all,
something
but they
that
were completely
I've
ignored by the
called
previous
for
Labor government.
consistently as well. So if I can just look at the arguments that people have made about why, and ask you to comment on those, why the various bodies that you've cited as being able to perform some of these functions don't actually do the complete job.
I'm sorry?
No, that's right. I'll just let you read that so that you can hear what I'm asking.
Yes, sorry.
All right. The INSLM looks specifically at the operation, effectiveness and implications of the legislation, and that the IGES doesn't do that. Would you agree that that's the case?
No, the IGES has a different role, and
Yeah.
that's the distinction I was
Yes, you did
pointing
make
out
that
before. The IGES looks at the operation of the agencies, not the legislation.
Yes. Another point that's made is that the INSLM, again, looks specifically at the operation, effectiveness and implications of the legislation in its entirety, which the Parliamentary Joint Committee doesn't do.
Well, these are all good observations, but the point I'm making to you, Senator, is this was a savings measure because
Yes.
the government felt, given that we had to find savings to begin to repair the financial train wreck that we inherited, that we had to trim bodies which, although perhaps worthy bodies, were of marginal utility.
And finally, the observation that the scrutiny or the review doesn't happen on an ongoing basis with the Parliament. The Parliament will look at it sporadically, but it will not look at it as an ongoing issue, and often it's triggered by sunset clauses and things like that.
Senator,
would you agree with that too?
I can't disagree with anything you say. This is the INSLM, which was originally an idea that came from the Liberal Party and was belatedly adopted by the Labor Party, was a good idea, but it was a marginal idea. There is no function of the INSLM that can't be performed by other bodies, but the observations you've made are good observations. If these were the days when we'd had a government which produced 10 budget surpluses in a row, and the country was awash with prosperity, and we lived in the land of milk and honey again, as we did when Mr. Howard was the Prime Minister, then we wouldn't be having this discussion. But sadly and shamefully, we now live in a time after we've had the 6 biggest budget deficits in Australian history consecutively, and we have to cut our cloth to suit our circumstances.
So we will look forward to seeing the response. Thank you.
Thank you,
Attorney
Senator
General.
Wright.
You're finished? Okay.